It is so nice to be here tonight with you, Julia, with you being in Adelaide and me being here in New York City. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to the elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal, Torres Straits Islanders, and Native American peoples who are joining us today.
I am delighted to be with you, Josephine. It's just so lovely to see you. I wish I could be in New York with you, but this is a great alternative.
You know, it's February the 10th when you were last here in New York. I miss you. That's 11 months away.
Wow,
But
that's ridiculous.
so we're here to talk about your book, Women and Leadership. And I think a really good place to start is to explain why I'm interviewing you. You and I have known each other for several years now. I was in awe of you before I met you, and I truly value our relationship, which has grown into a true friendship. Advance has been very important to me, and I'm proud to be the Ambassador Emeritus in the United States, and even prouder to be interviewing you tonight. You are a former patron of Advance, and we are delighted that you are here today.
Thank you very much, Josephine. And thank you very much, Josephine, and thank you for all the assistance you provided with the book. You were a great editorial friend as we were getting it done.
Well, actually, it was a lot of fun because if you think about it, you sent me the draft and you said you got, I think, 48 hours. So I just basically got down and we gave you a few ideas, and it was really nice to see it in here. I mean, this was like an amazing book. And we're going to talk about that tonight because I really was fortunate because I got the early preview. And what blew me away on the first reading and continued, I've now read the book 4 times. It's really a primer for everybody, older, younger, men and women, on how to be a good leader. What you've done is you've tracked themes of leadership using 8 unique stories of 8 unique women around the world and sharing stories and lessons that are applicable to everybody. I'd be fascinated to hear, and I know the people who are watching tonight would really like to understand what was the driving force for you and Ngozi to write this book.
Well, Josephine, I think you've won Editorial Friend Award and Most Persistent Reader Award 4 times. That's fantastic. For my co-author Ngozi and I, the impetus to write the book was really a set of conversations we started having about what was going on for women in leadership around the world. Ngozi and I had first met when I was Australian Prime Minister and she was Nigerian Finance Minister. But we really got to know each other post our political careers. I was chairing the Global Partnership for Education, which I still do. She was chairing the Global Vaccine Alliance, and we'd end up at these international events and we were drawn to each other and to conversations about what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in South Korea, what's going on in America with Hillary Clinton. And finally, those conversations turned into a determination to try and get to the bottom of the contemporary problems for women leaders, to share our knowledge, to share the research, and to tap into our networks to bring to women around the world and men the experiences of great women leaders.
So let's talk about those. Let's talk about those challenges for women who are at the top of their game, which is what you've talked about. But many of our members are younger and are wanting to get to the top of their game. How do you think the lessons that we've heard in the book relate to women earlier in their career?
Well, I think there are 3 ways, really. Number one, I think it's easy for young women to look at women who have achieved things in their lives, to look at women like you and me and to say to themselves, gee, they've got it all sussed, they've got it all worked out. Whereas if they could peek inside our heads, they'd know that there's still a set of worries and concerns and insecurities. And I think just knowing that might make young women feel more empowered about their own journey. It's not that somehow we're different creatures, we're all the same. Second, the challenges for women leaders have the white hot spotlight on them, but they're the same kind of challenges that women will face earlier on in their careers. So whilst the intensity of them might increase, the nature of them is largely the same. And third, I think it's really of use to young women to have the benefit of seeing this movie before. If they can learn from what women leaders have experienced and done on their way up, then I think that can be really useful in their own progression, so that they can be thinking to themselves, yes, when Hillary Clinton was at this stage of her career, or Jacinda Ardern was at a similar stage, they had these experiences and this is how they thought about them. I think that's a very energizing thing as well.
So let's dig a little into that. You have a number of hypotheses in the book, and hypothesis one refers to the saying, "You go, girl." And although not the phrase that was used during our childhood, certainly not mine, it captures really what, as you say, what your upbringings were like. What do you think were the early influences on the women that you've interviewed that have led them to be so exceptional?
Well, we interviewed 8 women from incredibly different cultures and contexts. And one of the things Ngozi and I were asking ourselves when we started on this project is, how much can truly be the same for an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to be president of Liberia, versus, say, Theresa May, who was the second woman to lead the United Kingdom. I mean, Liberia, UK, very different places. How much can actually be the same? And yet on this You Go Girl perspective, we found one thing that was the same for all of our women leaders, is that they came from a family environment where they were never told, no, you can't do that. Now, none of them was hothoused for leadership. None of them was told, when you grow up, girl, you'd better be president or prime minister, or don't darken the doorstep again. Your family doesn't want to know you unless you get this done. None of them came from an environment like that, but they came from a family where in their home, both their father and their mother modelled to them that their sense of aspiration was the same for both the girls and the boys, that there wasn't a set of closed doors simply because they were girls. And that, I think, is a very important foundation stone for each of us and for each of the women we interviewed.
Now, I want to change totally. Let's talk about hypothesis two. It's all about the hair. Now, that chapter looks at the incredible amount of extra time that women spend and the additional scrutiny they receive on their image in comparison to men. Now, I want to talk about working from home and the change in uniform, but I also must note that I spent a little bit of time trying to decide what to wear tonight. I actually haven't worn a jacket in probably 10 months. And so I finally decided to wear white with black. Now, you and I didn't consult, but I noticed that you are also wearing white and black. And you also talk about in the book about how Winston Churchill would never, ever talk to his in Parliament wearing a canary yellow jacket. So let's talk a little bit about uniforms and also how you think the pandemic has changed how people are involved in their attire and not wearing just sweatpants, which is what I'm wearing underneath my jacket, to be candid.
Yes, the benefits of the virtual engagements. You don't have to worry about heels, and you don't have to worry about any zip up clothing or stockings or anything like that. You can do the sweatpants, which is fantastic. This area of appearance, it's got some simple dimensions and some complex ones. I mean, the simple dimension is people are constantly intrigued about what women wear. And look at the incoming administration in the US. You can pick up, very high quality media outlets. I'm thinking of places like the New York Times and others, and they'll still have a piece on what Kamala Harris is wearing. No one's unpacking how President Biden's chosen his shirt or his tie, but it's Harris wears this or Harris does that. So people are constantly intrigued by what women wear, and that takes airtime away from more serious issues and what women are trying to say. It also just takes real time, because to meet the expectations about dress, hair, makeup, and the rest, it takes more time for women to get ready. And Hillary Clinton talks about this in the book and talks about losing days and days of campaign time in total because she needed to get hair and makeup done every day. But I think there's a deeper dimension too, which is we are honed, the sexist whispers in the back of our brain still tell us to judge women on how they look in a way that we don't judge men. So, to take an example, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he is known around the world for a sort of, messy mop hair, a bit dishevelled, known for turning up at an event and his shirt might be not buttoned up properly or untucked or whatever. And people comment on that, but through the prism of it being a sort of interesting eccentricity, not that it tells us anything about his character. Whereas I think a woman who turned up with messy hair and dishevelled clothing, people would think that that says something about her character, that she wasn't up to it, that she was sort of slovenly, that she couldn't be a clear thinker or a hard worker if she got out the door every day looking like that. It would be seen to be saying something profound about her. The women leaders that we interviewed all got this, and that they were being judged on their appearance each and every day, and they reacted to the pressures of that differently. Some of them just sort of developed a uniform, a standard look, in the hope that if they looked basically the same every day, that would cut out ultimately commentary on appearance. Theresa May, in contrast, has always been interested in fashion, and she decided to continue to convey that interest and be thoughtful about what she wore, because she liked, as a hobby almost, to look at fashion magazines and to select fashionable clothing. But she did that knowing that that meant that people would talk a lot about what she was wearing. So there's no one right answer here. Will standards change because of the pandemic? I think they probably will a little bit. Not potentially for leaders, for people who are right out in the public eye, politicians, CEOs of businesses, chair people of corporate boards. I think people will still expect them, when they appear publicly, to be doing it in, suits or the equivalent for women. But I think in the office, there will be a new approach, that people will blend this virtual work with in-office work. We'll see different working styles and consequently different working wardrobes. And if that means that people can wear things that are more comfortable, less, the subject of judgments about whether you've got the latest look, that would be a fantastic thing.
Now, you will always be known, despite so many things that you have done since, but you're always going to be known as Australia's first female Prime Minister. I think more important is not just the fact that you're Prime Minister, but how much you achieved during your tenure. I mean, you think about it, you were the 14th longest serving of all 30 Prime Ministers, and during your tenure of 3 years and 3 days, you accomplished over and passed over 590 pieces of legislature. I mean, you think about it, you've lived through your time as Prime Minister. They were very trying times. And I'd love to know what was good about being a woman in Parliament, and what did you want, and how did you want to be considered as a leader?
I think there were some great things about being a woman in Parliament, and I'm really glad you've asked me this question, because inevitably when we talk about gender and leadership, we're focusing on the continued barriers. And I do worry, and we talk about this in the book, that because we do that, sometimes we forget to impart to women who may be thinking about journeying to leadership in politics or business or whatever, we might forget to convey to them that there are joys and delights in being a leader. And we might therefore put them off, and that certainly isn't my intention. For me, being a woman in Parliament, there was the specific things about being a woman and just the great things generally about being a leader. I mean, I'll never have a bigger opportunity in my life to make big things happen, to put my values into action, than I had as a parliamentarian, and particularly as Prime Minister. And there is an incredible sense of accomplishment that comes with that. And I'm a big advocate for politics as a career path for men and women, but we particularly need more women. In terms of specifically being a woman, I had a real sense that I was helping bring to life the promise of the Australian Labor Party committing itself to having more women in Parliament through things like its affirmative action rules, that we'd said we were going to do it. And here I was with a cohort of women actually getting it done, bringing women's voices and perspectives to the Parliament. We obviously stood out because there were still fewer women than men, and there was therefore an interest and intrigue in us and what we were going to do. But I also specifically set out, Australian Parliament is a highly adversarial place. We have this ritualised question time every day, which is a form of parliamentary combat. And I think there was a question mark in many people's minds about whether women could take that rough and tumble. And one of the things that I set out to show was even in the most adversarial of environments, a woman could dominate. And so I did want to be noted as someone who was a parliamentarian who could stand out in that theatre.
Well, you sure did. You went for it, girl. Forgive me, but I don't think any discussion with you would be complete without talking about what The Guardian called the most unforgettable TV moment. It's your 2012 parliamentary speech on misogyny. Now, that speech has recently had a resurgence because TikTok picked it up last year. There's been countless words that have been used to describe. And I think about one of my other favorite leadership books is a book by a New Zealander, Pamela Allen, who wrote Who Sank the Boat? And it's basically a story of 5 animals, a cow, a donkey, a sheep, a pig, and a little mouse trying to get into a boat. Now, spoiler alert, the mouse is blamed for sinking the boat. So the mouse made the smallest impact, but it was the final straw. What was the final straw for you? Your speech was so emotional and so well put. What was that final straw? Who sank that boat for you?
I think we need to start a campaign, The Mouse is Innocent, or something like that. But for me, the final straw, I think, was, I'd taken the perspective when I became Prime Minister that it was just so obvious I was the first woman to do the job that I personally didn't need to go on about it. And I also thought that the more I was in the job, the less interest there would be in me being the first woman, that there'd be a lot of interest at the start and then it would go back to being politics as normal. What I actually found was the longer I was in the job, the more gendered the commentary became. As the government did controversial things, the gendered insult, for example, became a very go-to weapon. And I'd sort of, just held my counsel around all of that. I hadn't responded, I hadn't bitten back, I hadn't said anything about it. And then there was this parliamentary day, and the mouse was that on this parliamentary day, for a set of circumstances about the politics of that day, we were going to have a question time devoted to sexism in politics, where the opposition was going to challenge me as to whether or not I was good enough at fighting sexism. And after everything I'd endured, to have that put to me was the mouse that sank the boat, that then meant, no, it's time to take this on and to take it on very forcefully. And I was prepared to take it on forcefully in question time. But what actually happened in the procedures of the Parliament is we ended up having an instantaneous debate. And the speech that's come to be known as the misogyny speech is my speech in that debate.
Well, it was remarkable. And I've personally watched it even more times than I've read your book, because I think not only what you said, but how you said it was just so unbelievably powerful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, this book is unique because it not only provides a focus on women, but it also provides tremendous global perspectives that hasn't been shared before. As you said, Theresa May and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. We know that there are vast cultural differences in so many different leaderships across different countries. But what kind of Aussie traits do you feel have worked in Australians' favour when abroad, particularly for the advanced group? And what do you think and feel that are our most misunderstood traits as Aussies?
Well, if I could start with a misunderstanding first, I think because we live in such a beautiful country and the image overseas of Australia is of, beaches and outback landscapes and sort of, larrikin Aussies enjoying this environment. I think people often misunderstand how hardworking Australians are. And one of the clear pieces of feedback I get when I travel, when we used to be able to do that, and I would talk to people overseas who employ Australians or work with Australians. That terminology, they're so hardworking, was always at the top of what they wanted to convey to me. So I don't think necessarily we have a global reputation for that, but that is true about us. And then one trait which I think is a great strength but can potentially be misunderstood, Australians are egalitarian by nature. We're not deferential to hierarchies. We don't have that sense of aristocracy or anything like that. We have that casualness where, people will run up to the Prime Minister of the country. This happened to me all the time. Even, little kids in school will run up to the Prime Minister and say, Julia, Julia, Julia. It wouldn't even occur to them that they should say Prime Minister Gillard or anything like that. And I think we take that culture with us abroad. I think it's a great thing because it means that we forge bonds easily, that we put our ideas without feeling stymied by structures, that we're the kind of people who can move in all sorts of environments. But I think in some very protocol-driven places, that it can be misunderstood, that if people don't see it or don't know about it as an Australian trait, because we're not doing the very staid old protocol, people can think that it's rudeness. But when they get to know us, I think they do identify it as a very big strength.
Fair enough. Now, you just stated a minute ago that you made a difference as being Prime Minister, and that's clearly a really place where you are on stage. However, since finishing in politics, you've also been clear not to move on to be a political commentator, for instance. What drove you to take on a role overseas and be the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership in the UK?
Well, I took with me out of politics this fascination with gender and leadership because I kind of made the mistake of thinking that all issues around me being a woman leader would fall away. I left politics dissatisfied with how I'd responded on this question of women in leadership. I'd misunderstood it and I wanted to understand it better. And my first foray into understanding it better was when I sat down to write my first book, my biography, and I put in it a chapter around gender. So I started looking outwards at the experiences of other women leaders, at the global research base, to help me really process my own set of experiences and better get to grips with them. And once I got on that intellectual journey, and in some ways emotional journey too, I just got more and more intrigued and more fascinated. So when I had the opportunity to put a big idea to King's College in London, let's create a global institute for women's leadership, they said, yes, let's do it. And that means that this isn't me anymore just puzzling my way through these questions. It's fine global quality researchers who are working on some of the most interesting issues about how people see women leaders today and what we can do to ensure that more women come through for leadership in all walks of life. And it's really the same impulse that led me to the discussions with Ngozi and ultimately to the book, to make a contribution to accelerating the rate of change for women leaders.
And I thank you for that. I thank you on behalf of so many other women that I know who extol those kinds of values too. Were there advantages for you being outside of Australia to be able to do something like this?
There are advantages. I mean, I, love my country. I love being at home. In some ways, the pandemic forcing me to not be on any planes has had the upside that I've had more time in my home, more time with family. So in, every sense, I'm an Australian through and through. But working overseas does give me some advantages. I think you get a different perspective when you're away and you look back at your nation than when you're at home in your nation, and I've valued that. It's given me a new circle of, colleagues and contacts, and I think it's always enriching to be meeting new people and gathering energy from their ideas and new things to think about. And personally, too, it does give me the benefit of a bit more anonymity. When I walk down an Australian street, I'm recognised by almost everybody, and that's lovely. And I get into lots of conversations because of that. But there's also, a time when it's nice to be able to walk down a street in London or New York or many other places in the world and just be in your own time and be in your own space and not be so visible.
I can understand that. So let's talk a little bit about American politics. Here in the United States, 2021 has sure had a tumultuous start. And last week, President Biden was inaugurated. And so we start a new chapter in American history. What advice would you give each of the leaders to the new administration to make them more successful? I particularly look at somebody like Hillary Clinton, who you had a wonderful interview with, maybe Christine Lagarde too. But it'd be fascinating to see what would the advice that you would give the new administration.
Well, first and foremost, what a relief to see the inauguration and to see the new administration taking charge and starting to get to grips with some of the very profound problems facing the United States. First and foremost, of course, getting to grips with the virus, getting the vaccinations out, decreasing the incidence of new cases. So I'm wishing them well from my corner of the world, that everything goes as they want it to. I think it's a critical time in America's political history. In terms of advice, I'm not sure that a politician as experienced as Joe Biden or a woman as accomplished as Vice President Harris particularly needs my advice. But, for me, what kept me going in politics, in government, was to be very clear about the purpose that was driving me and the big things we needed to do. Politics is very pressurised, the political environment is very fragmented, very polarised, and it's easy to get swamped every day by the things that are important in that minute, but won't be important in 5, 10, 15 years' time. And you've always got to steady yourself to be getting the big things done, which will matter in the decades to come. And then for Vice President Harris particularly, I do think that in the way she approached campaigning and in these early days of the administration, she and her team have clearly thought very deeply about her being the first woman to hold this position. They've had the benefits of seeing what happened to Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign. They've had the benefits of seeing the experiences of women who got to the top, Christine Lagarde and others, in institutions which had their own old-fashioned outlooks on the world, like the IMF. And I think they're being very sophisticated about how they handle this question of gender. And one of the things they and the supporters of the administration are doing is they're taking the gender issue head on. They're not letting it just roll and then waiting till it gets really bad. Even in the campaign, when there were the first gendered critiques of Vice President Harris, people were in the media field, on social media, calling it out, getting people to face it. And I think with the benefit of the knowledge I have now from my own experiences, that's exactly the right approach.
So do I hear Women in Leadership, volume number 2, that we could start off with Ms. Harris?
I'm still, I think both Ngozi and I would say we're still out and about with this book, but always open to ideas for future works.
Like that. So this year, you're going to be starting a brand new role as chair of the Wellcome Trust, starting very soon. It's a very timely appointment. You think about the problems that we face in the next 4 years, they're going to take even more global cooperation to solve. Just look at the pandemic. What position will the Wellcome Trust play on the global stage in the next 4 years with you at the helm?
I'm aware many people are probably not familiar with the Wellcome Trust, even though it's a huge, one of the biggest, second to the Gates Foundation, philanthropic funds in the world. It's not welcome in the sense of, hello, how are you? It is a philanthropic fund that was established by a man called Henry Wellcome, who was a scientist who left his funds for the benefit of health and medical research. He also left his collection of scientific objects, and all these years later, the Wellcome Trust is a fund that's valued at over £30 billion, English pounds, and the Wellcome collection is there for all to see when it's not restricted because of the pandemic. The Wellcome Trust, for a long period of time, has focused on the science of infectious diseases. And so it is very much now focused on COVID. People may routinely in the international media see the CEO of the Wellcome Trust, Jeremy Farrar, who is an infectious diseases expert, talking about things like how Wellcome is supporting the Therapeutics Accelerator to get more treatments for COVID-19, how we're investing in the International Fund to try and bring the vaccine to everyone, how Wellcome-funded institutions have been at the forefront of sequencing the genomics of the virus, and on it goes. So for the next 4 years, you would see that work, that key work on infectious diseases continue. But the Wellcome Trust has also selected two other priorities: mental health, which is something very close to my heart. My father was a psychiatric nurse. Here in Australia, I chair Beyond Blue, which is Australia's best known mental health body. And the third priority is health issues that are exacerbated by climate change. As our climate changes, so do a set of challenges around health. I mean, all of this is basically informed by the value system that the health of each of us ultimately depends on the health of all of us. And if there's one lesson to take from the pandemic, it's that we can't be a safe world until everyone is safe from this virus and everyone is vaccinated. And so if we live with that value system for other health challenges, it means I think we will live in a world where people get to live their best lives in health terms, and that will be a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Well, thank you for taking on that role. It's going to become even more important than it ever has been. So I look forward to hearing great things about that and visiting you in the UK. Now, last year, there was the Forbes Women Power Summit, and many of your incredible colleagues were speakers in that summit. And the question that they were asked, and every single one of them was asked the same question, is to define what power means to them. So I'm going to ask you, how do you define power?
For me, power is the ability to get big things done, to put your values into action. Now, that doesn't mean that any individual has all of the power to do that. To get really big things done requires the efforts of a team. You don't make change at scale unless you're working with a team. But power means you're the person who can light the fire, who can strike the match and say, this is what we're going to do and let's go and get it done. So for me, power as Prime Minister was about saying the government's priority is fairer funding for schools, which will enable us to lift children out of disadvantage and have a better education system for all. It was about saying we are going to build a national disability insurance scheme that means Australians with profound disabilities get better supported and get to make more choices about how they want to live their lives. It was about saying we're going to strike a new relationship with China where we agree to annual leaders level summits. So in then translating those things into action, many, many people were involved, but you're at the centre with the power to say, I've listened, I've consulted, but now I've defined the priorities and this is where we're going and this is what we're going to do.
Now, that very same chapter closes with a note to self and the recommendations and the approach to create a network and I quote, that deliberately opens a door for and then nurtures talented young women. So how do we make that happen for the next generation?
Well, for me, really, the book is a big way to help make that happen. I think as women who have had the opportunity to lead in different professions, we've got an obligation to give back. And each of us tries to do that in different ways, but and Ngozi and I talked about this a lot. You know, both of us were constantly asked by young women to mentor them, to sponsor them, to work with them. And we tried to do as much of that as we could, but there's just a physical constraint. And Ngozi in particular used to get and continues to get huge volumes of requests because there aren't that many role models of women of colour on the global stage. And so for us, the book is about synthesising what we'd want to do in that role modelling relationship and putting it out for all to see. Now, that doesn't mean that the book isn't of interest to others, but I think it will be of particular interest to young women who will read it as a kind of how-to guide, issues to think about, things to work through as they walk their own pathway to power. For me, the work I do at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is a contribution to that too. The better evidence we have about the barriers and how to get rid of them, the more we can convey to people in power today, but also the young women who will be in power tomorrow about how to create gender equality as quickly as we can. So for me, that's how I'm trying to live true to the promise of making a difference for young women. And I'm really enthusiastic about this up and coming generation. I think they are rightly out of patience with the restrictions for women, and they're really going to bust through them, and it's going to be incredible to watch as it happens.
Well said. So now I want to ask you some rat-a-tat, rapid-fire questions. One-word answer.
I'll do
Favorite
my
moment
best.
when interviewing? Okay. Favorite moment when interviewing the women in Women in Leadership? You can have 5 words on
Joking,
that one.
joking with the Prime Minister of Norway, Erna Solberg, about resting bitch face.
Australian food that you miss the most when overseas?
Oh, Tim Tams. If you're going to indulge in a biscuit, you've got to have a Tim Tam.
I agree. Favorite book of 2020?
I really liked Tara June Winch, her book, The Yield, and I would recommend it to all.
Favorite TV show or movie of 2020?
I enjoyed the series of Killing Eve that came on in 2020. A lot of series kind of, drift away the more that they do, but I think they're sustaining it and they're two fantastic actors.
You get good news? Who do you call first?
A family member, because if I speak to one, then they'll speak to each other. It's the time efficient way of doing it.
Favorite restaurant in Australia, London, or New York? You pick.
Look, I could do lists for each, but I'm going to say Star of Greece in Adelaide, my hometown. It's a restaurant where you get a panoramic view of the coastline. I always take overseas visitors there because I think it really visibly shows how beautiful our country is.
I can't wait to go with you. Now, who is the funniest person, past or present, in Aussie politics? And you have a huge cast of characters to choose from.
Oh, if we were going into the past, Mick Young, a formidable a Labor politician who grew up as a shearer, ended up a leading politician, incredibly funny man, and people still retell jokes that Mick Young originally told. In my generation, I would say Warren Snowden, who served as the member for Lingiari, which is the huge electorate that covers almost all of the Northern Territory. Warren's way of doing politics was to get his swag and his vehicle and go into the outback and spend time with communities, particularly Indigenous communities. But in Canberra, he was always someone who was ready with a smile and a joke and kept all of our spirits up.
Where do you want to spend your 60th birthday, which is this year?
I'd like to just spend it at home, and really for me, it's a simple combination. Family, friends, food, that'll do me.
Now, a lot of people know that we're both bibliophiles, but few know about our private book club. So, would you like to share what you're reading at the moment and what your next recommendation for me is going to be?
Well, I just finished one you recommended, but you recommended it so long ago you've probably forgotten. But it was called The Kingdom by Joe Nesbo, a
Right.
Norwegian writer who I enjoyed it. And he is such a character. What a life. He was an investment banker, he was a rock star, and now he writes books. So I enjoyed that. I'm returning now to my pandemic promise to myself. I made this nutty promise that I was going to read in order the collected works of Virginia Woolf. Needless to say, this is going to take longer than the pandemic, but I'm up to the waves is the next one, so I'm on to that.
So let's talk about Virginia Woolf because you have a podcast. You have a podcast of that you, and in each of those podcasts, which I have to tell you, not only do I recommend reading your book, I also recommend listening to your podcasts. They're so illuminating and so thought provocative. It's now my turn to turn the table on you. If you had, um, if you think about what the question is you had all the power in the world for one day, what would make one decision to improve the life of women, and what would you do?
I asked this question on my podcast, and it's such a hard one. Now I feel sorry for all the women I've asked it of. But if I could do one thing, I think I would equalise education for women everywhere. In our societies, that job has already been done, but in so many parts of the world, it hasn't. And there are hundreds of millions of girls who miss out on a quality education. And whilst a quality education isn't the answer to gender equality, because if it was, our societies would already be gender equal, it's not the answer, but it's a necessary precondition. If you don't get that right, then you can't ever get gender equality in your society. So educating girls.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this brilliant dialogue for us at Advance. We cannot wait to have you back in New York and to throw you some incredible, incredible book parties to celebrate the launch in the United States, which is next week, of Women in Leadership. It's going to be available next February the 2nd, which is next week on Amazon. And I can't encourage anybody enough to pick up a copy. I know it's going to be my go-to present to give this year. So thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Josephine, for all your help and friendship and for this wonderful conversation.